Accord at Meech Lake was a dark day for Canada, but for Brian Mulroney and the 10 premiers who reached unexpected agreement, it was a momentous day. There was a giddy sense of achievement. The impossible had happened. Quebec would be brought into the Constitution. But what really went on at that secluded retreat? What influences united a room full of provinces who've rarely stood together? What lessons did the premiers and Mulroney bring to the table? The Journal's Terry McKenna has this report on the deal at Meech Lake.
Welcome to Meech Lake. I hope you have a nice day.
Brian Mulroney called upon his old labor negotiating skills to attain the Meech Lake Accord. Once the premiers were in the room, they were not allowed to consult with any of their advisors, a rule enforced by the Prime Minister's bodyguards even when a premier would slip out to go to the bathroom. The Prime Minister insisted on privacy and seclusion, and was intent on keeping the premiers locked in that room until a deal was struck, long into the night if necessary. The upside of that method is that Mr. Mulroney got his deal, meeting all of Quebec's 5 demands and pleasing the other premiers. The downside of the method, according to some advisors, is that some premiers didn't realize the implications of what they were signing. The long meeting ended late at night in a kind of dazed euphoria, with premiers becoming wide-eyed autograph seekers.
I want to give signatures. You're destroying signatures.
For a change, even the Premier of Quebec was happy.
I mean, there were a strong political will on the parts of all the premiers, and strong leadership also on the part of the Prime Minister.
The Mulroney constitution-making style contrasts sharply with that of Pierre Trudeau, who presided over years of bickering and ended up with a deal excluding the Quebec government. But the architects of the 1981 Constitutional Accord, such as former Justice Minister Jean Chrétien, say that Brian Mulroney attained his quick success only by giving away the store to the premiers.
I think Bourassa had been a master at politics in there. You know, he got his meeting when the Prime Minister was at 23% in the poll, who wanted to make a deal. Mr. Bourassa came with 5 demands, and he got 8 yes. So I don't know what would have been the real negotiation position there, you know, because Mulroney came there as the head waiter, and he said, "What do you want, but guys?" and he delivered.
As clerk of the Privy Council, Michael Pitfield was Canada's highest-ranking civil servant when the Constitution was patriated in 1982. Today, he is an independent senator. This constitutional expert says he can't understand the Meech Lake Accord.
No, I've looked at it upside and downside, and there are large parts of it I can't make head or tails of.
Many supporters of the Accord would say, this is just sour grapes from the Trudeauites, from the Pitfields and the Chrétiens. What else would you expect? They never got this Accord. They're jealous.
At the moment, the central Canadian vision of Canada, the centralized Canada vision, is very much regarded as the product of the Trudeau movement and the people associated with Trudeau. The fact that it has a lineage that goes back to the dawn of Confederation, that there have been political leaders in every generation, Laurier, others who have been exponents of it, is at the moment submerged.
The Meech Lake Accord, like all other constitutional proposals, is measured in terms of the 2 opposing visions of Canada which date back to Confederation. The collision of these visions has dominated the last 20 years, sometimes going by different names: centralism versus decentralism, federal power versus provincial power, one Canada versus deux nations, one Canada versus a community of communities. Brian Mulroney's approach to the Constitution was strongly influenced by events he witnessed when he was 28 years old, in 1967.
Canada was 100 years old and celebrating. The mood was forward-looking and optimistic, and the nation's leaders addressed themselves to the Confederation of Tomorrow. The Quiet Revolution had triggered a nationalist wave in Quebec, and Premier Daniel Johnson was looking for more power to go with it. Quebec wanted special status in Confederation and a new definition of the relationship between Canada's two founding peoples, which he called deux nations.
By public opinion.
The Progressive Conservative Party wanted to come to terms with the new Quebec, and so party leaders came to a conference in Montmorency, where Daniel Johnson's constitutional advisor asked them to accept deux nations. Marcel Faribault.
The same way, the question of the two nations is no longer debatable in the province of Quebec. Admit that you must put in the preamble of a new constitution something which will be the recognition that there are in this country two founding people. You put that down.
Bob Stanfield and other Tory leadership candidates embraced deux nations. But at the 1967 Leadership Convention, outgoing leader John Diefenbaker told them they were making a big mistake.
The theory that Canada is two nations can only lead to division and dissension in this country.
The next Prime Minister of Canada, Bob Stanfield.
Convention winner Bob Stanfield ignored Diefenbaker's warnings and went on to make deux nations part of his election campaign platform, with disastrous results. At the same time, Liberal Justice Minister Pierre Trudeau's career took off as he led the battle against deux nations, or any special status for Quebec. His attacks on Daniel Johnson at the 1968 Constitutional Conference irked the Quebec Premier.
When I talked about difficulty with the interlocutor, I didn't mean the federal government. Specifically, it was with the Minister of Justice.
Pierre Trudeau went on to decimate the new conservative policy of deux nations in the 1968 election campaign. And for almost 2 decades, he whipped Bob Stanfield and Joe Clark over every subsequent attempt the Tories made to accommodate Quebec nationalism. Brian Mulrooney learned something from the Tories' hard lessons in Quebec. In his 1983 book, Where I Stand, he steered away from deux nations, saying, "I do not believe in a theory of 2 nations, 5 nations, or 10 nations. Nor do I believe in any concept that would give any one province an advantage over any other." In the Meech Lake Accord, Mr. Mulrooney avoided the label deux nations, but the text sounds close to the conservative vision from 20 years ago. The Meech Lake Accord will enshrine in the Constitution the recognition that the existence of French-speaking Canada, centered in but not limited to Quebec, and English-speaking Canada, concentrated outside Quebec but also present in Quebec, constitutes a fundamental characteristic of Canada. That Parliament and provincial legislatures are committed to preserving that characteristic. But the Accord also includes the recognition that Quebec constitutes within Canada a distinct society, and that the role of the legislature and government of Quebec to preserve and promote the distinct identity of Quebec is affirmed. At Quebec Parliamentary Commission hearings to review the Meech Lake Accord, Quebec's Intergovernmental Affairs Minister Gilles Rémillard and Premier Robert Bourassa are saying this accord fulfills the demands Quebec has been making for 20 years.
We are coming with clear principles that Quebec is a distinct society. And again, it's a question of fact which is recognized in the Canadian Constitution, that the government of Quebec and the National Assembly could have powers, are having the powers to promote, not only to preserve, but to promote the distinct entity of Quebec.
But Parti Québécois leader Pierre-Marc Johnson, the son of the former premier, says this agreement doesn't come close to what his father was looking for 20 years ago.
Has Quebec achieved the kind of special status finally?
Oh, no. No, maybe in the mind of Mr. Rémillard and Mr. Bourassa, and a couple of sort of extragalactic jurists, yes. But I think in practice, no. We're very far away from that.
Prince Edward Island's Joe Giz is one of those premiers who says that the Distinct Society Clause gives Quebec nothing more than any other province has.
I don't think any more power than it places in the hands of any other province. I think that the government of Quebec quite naturally has a responsibility to protect and enhance the society of Quebec, much like the government of Prince Edward Island has an obligation to protect.
It's not going to be recognized in the Constitution as a distinct society.
Oh, we are. We are. We're recognized in Section 42 of the Constitution because we are guaranteed under the Constitution 4 members of Parliament. No other province in Canada is guaranteed that.
The last constitutional deal that Robert Bourassa signed was the Victoria Charter in 1971, and within weeks he was forced to back out of the deal under pressure from a massive wave of nationalist resistance in Quebec. Today, similar attempts to stop Bourassa are falling flat. This anti-Meech Lake demonstration in Montreal this week drew only 250 people.
The recognition of Quebec as a distinct society is only one reason that Pierre Trudeau and others are upset by the Meech Lake Accord. The Accord gives sweeping new powers to the provinces in many areas, including nominations to the Senate and the Supreme Court, but nothing upsets the centralists more than the new limitations of federal spending power. This battle began in earnest 10 years ago when Joe Clark became leader of the Conservative Party.
Mr. Clark met with 4 Tory premiers in Kingston in 1977 and promised them that if he became Prime Minister, he would give the provinces a veto over all federal spending in areas of provincial jurisdiction. The premiers were delighted. But in the House of Commons, Mr. Clark was viciously attacked by Pierre Trudeau.
Because he's already shown us at Kingston how he would do it, Mr. Speaker. Anything the provinces ask, he gives them. And he comes back and says, I brought a great victory. There was no confrontation. Look what I did at Kingston.
Mr. Clark was undeterred and went on to campaign in the 1979 election on his more decentralized vision of Canada.
In an immense country, you live on a local scale, and governments make the nation work by recognizing that we are fundamentally a community of communities.
At the constitutional conferences following the Quebec referendum, René Lévesque convinced most other premiers to demand fiscal compensation for any province which chose to opt out of federal spending programs in areas of provincial jurisdiction. Newfoundland's Brian Peckford said that henceforth the federal government should merely be the agent of the provinces in Ottawa.
Mr. Prime Minister and Mr. Lévesque articulated 2 different visions of Canada, and I would have to side with the theory advocated by Mr. Lévesque. There's no question about that. And that we've got to recognize...
The Federal Conservative Party supported the Premier's new demands, to the astonishment of Pierre Trudeau.
I think some of them see Canada as a confederation of shopping centers.
In the Conservative leadership race, Joe Clark continued to promise Quebec fiscal compensation for opting out of federal spending programs. But this time, it was Brian Mulroney who attacked the idea.
Before I give away a plug nickel of Canada's money, I want to know what Mr. Lévesque is going to do for Canada.
But after winning the Conservative leadership, Mr. Mulroney apparently had a change of heart. During the 1984 election campaign, he began to court the premiers and the province of Quebec with vague promises to halt federal intrusions into areas of provincial jurisdiction. These promises were made only in French, in Sept-Îles, Quebec. By the time he arrived in Meech Lake, Mr. Mulroney's about-face was complete. He offered the premiers 2 major new limitations on federal spending power. First, a provincial veto. The federal government would require permission of 7 provinces representing 50% of the population before spending in these areas. Some premiers of the smaller provinces, led by Newfoundland's Brian Peckford and Manitoba's Howard Pauley, said the federal government was giving away too much.
We had problems with the original Quebec proposal. We had difficulty with the original federal government proposal, which would have required the approval of 7 out of 10 provinces. I said, count us out, if indeed that is the proposal that's going to survive this meeting.
Mr. Mulroney also offered provinces the right to opt out of these federal spending programs with fiscal compensation for any province with an equivalent program meeting national standards. Robert Bourassa wanted even more latitude for a province to opt out and demand compensation for a program that was not equivalent, but merely compatible, and not with national standards, but merely national objectives. Brian Mulroney said, okay. The premiers who signed the Meech Lake Accord have radically differing interpretations of the spending power provision.
And for those who would argue that you've transgressed the spending power, you've inhibited the power of Parliament to spend money, my answer to that is a simple no. The power of the central government to enact spending policies has not been altered or abrogated in one way.
And I believe for us, In the case of Quebec, at least, it is a significant limitation.
Robert Bourassa sees a significant new limitation on federal spending power. Do you?
I have serious concern about that, about the interpretation of that from quite a different direction, I suppose, than Premier Bourassa. I believe there must be reasonable power on the part of the federal government to initiate new social programs. So yes, I am a little bit concerned when I hear suggestions that it can be interpreted much more widely than I think it was ever intended that it be interpreted.
In the past, the federal government used national standards to compel provinces to offer Canadians the same level of health care services all over the country. Now national standards will be replaced by national objectives, and the Meech Lake Accord does not even spell out who will set the national objectives. Brian Mulroney gave one interpretation to the House of Commons.
In regard to who would set the national objectives? Parliament of Canada.
But just try to get Robert Bourassa to agree with the Prime Minister's interpretation.
Who will determine the objectives of the national program?
We are in discussion now, as you know, with the other provinces and the federal government. We want to have some flexibility.
But who determines the national objectives? Mr. Mulroney has said in the Parliament that it is the Parliament of Canada, the federal Parliament, that determines the national objectives. Do you agree with him?
Yeah, for our purpose, what is important is to have the flexibility. We don't want the national objective to replace some norm of criteria.
Consider the construction of the Trans-Canada Highway, built with federal funds in an area of provincial jurisdiction. It was built to exacting standards set by the federal government, right down to the exact width and thickness of the pavement. Under Quebec's interpretation of the Meech Lake Accord, if the Trans-Canada Highway was being built today, when it reached the Quebec border, some critics say it might become a sidewalk or a bridge.
Mr. Remillard, your minister said that if there was a national sidewalk program, well, maybe you could take the money and build bridges. Is that the way you see it?
I mean, that's in the field. Mr. Remillard was just quoting an example when they're relatively the same field, bridges or roads. I could talk about the family policy and daycare. But if we have a daycare program in this province, and we are forced, according to federal norms and criteria, to have a different daycare system, I don't think the federal system will be better off.
In fact, at Meech Lake, Mr. Bourassa told at least one premier that Quebec could take the money for a national daycare program and use it to stimulate the Quebec birth rate by paying couples to have a third child.
Do you feel somewhat uneasy about committing fairly ambiguous language into the fundamental law of the land?
Yeah, and that's why we're concerned, and discussions, the officials have been involved, and our own lawyers in attempting to reduce the chance of ambiguity. I think it's important that Parliament and legislators make the decisions, that areas where there is indeed no consensus be left to the political process and not to the courts, non-elected bodies, to make the interpretation.
Prince Edward Island's Joe Giz thinks it's a good idea to let judges sort out these problems in the future.
Well, you know, in this country, we're either going to have to leave it to the judges or leave it to the politicians. And in this case, we're leaving it to the judges. But the politicians always have the upper hand in that they can come in and, in effect, take that away from the judges. But somebody has to be the arbiter. And in this situation, I feel quite comfortable in having an objective tribunal of Supreme Court judges determining the issue.
Today, Pierre Trudeau said that the Meech Lake Accord is a sellout of federal power, which will lead to the balkanization of the country. Most of his former aides, like Jean Chrétien and Michael Pitfield, agree.
We see a departure from a Canada with a strong central government towards a Canada which is much more of the so-called community of communities.
But former Trudeau cabinet minister Jean-Luc Pépin thinks they are overreacting.
Some people really see chaos or drama where it really does not exist, but that's the name of the game. Some people see any change that happens in Canada as a balkanization of the country. It is an obsession of the mind, and generally speaking, they also contradict themselves, because half an hour after they said that they love the provinces.
The only public review of the Meech Lake Accord in the country came at these Quebec Parliamentary Commission hearings. It's been a politically painful process for the Bourassa government. The televised hearings have focused and accelerated opposition to the accord in Quebec. It's a process that Brian Mulroney is not anxious to repeat for the rest of the country. The architects of the 1981 federal constitutional proposals faced weeks of public hearings on their proposal. Jean Chrétien thinks the present government should face the same process.
I think that because I was confronted with 124 hours of testimony, the camera on me all the time, you know, I think that by the end of the process, I think that there was a larger consensus than otherwise it would have been.
You would encourage the Prime Minister to do the same thing?
You know, I think that they will, but, you know, apparently the 3rd of June is going to be sealed in cement. And that will be it.
I can't understand why the government is in the hurry that it states itself to be in.
I suppose that Brian Mulroney would say that if you submit it to parliamentary committees, if you spend time and open the process up to let everybody have their opinion, this will be a divisive process that will just destroy this accord, leave Quebec out of the Constitution, and better to take the agreement and run, as another Prime Minister said.
In other words, you should have fundamental law passed by stealth.
That's what you think is happening here?
Well, it seems to me that the description of the process that you make amounts to that.
Why is there so much secrecy about the legal details of the agreement?
Yes, I would prefer, and I'm not going to defend that, I would actually would prefer, and so indicated, that that the information be fully discussed.
Do you think the Prime Minister's in too big a rush?
If the spending power provision continues to suffer from ambiguity, I think it would be much better to take more time and ensure that there be no ambiguity, that we don't leave anything to chance in the future in the courts.
But Brian Mulroney is planning to bring the premiers back to Meech Lake next week. He is betting that once the doors are again closed and the advisors and other dissenting voices are shut out, he will be able to nudge the premiers back into line. It may be that Mr. Mulroney once shared Pierre Trudeau's centralist vision of the country, but today Pierre Trudeau said they are completely at odds. Next week, Brian Mulroney will try to enshrine his vision in the Constitution, and it appears unlikely that Pierre Trudeau can stop him. For the Journal, I'm Terence McKenna.
The Journal